Good evening and welcome back. Settle in, lower the lights if you'd like. There is nothing here you need to do tonight. Only listen and let the world grow quiet around you. It is 2 hours past midnight on the 12th of October 1492. 3 small ships are running west before a fair wind, under a late moon, 33 days out from the last land anyone aboard has seen. The crews are past exhaustion and just past mutiny. 3 days earlier, their commander taught them out of turning for home with a promise. 3 more days, and if nothing came, they would turn back. This is the 3rd night. On the forecastle of the Pinta, a sailor from Seville named Rodrigo de Triana is staring into the darkness ahead, and somewhere in that darkness, low and pale, a line, sand white under the moon. He cries out the 2 words every man aboard has dreamed of for a month: land, land, and a cannon shot rolls across the water to the other ships. And on the far side of that pale line, on an island whose people call it Guanahani, the sound goes out over sleeping villages that have no idea and no way to have any idea that the whole direction of the world has just changed. This is the story of Christopher Columbus, the crossing of the ocean sea, and the 2 worlds that met on that beach, for better and very much for worse. He was born in Genoa, most likely in 1451, the son of a wool weaver, a plain artisan family in a steep, crowded city that lived by the sea and thought in ledgers. Genoa bred sailors the way other cities bred stonemasons, and the boy went to sea young, by his own account at 10. He learned his trade the ordinary way, port by port, down the Mediterranean lanes, out to the Genoese trading stations, wherever a ship would carry him. We should be honest that the young Columbus is half shadow. He told his own story, late, selectively, and with an eye to his legend, and the documents fill in only fragments. A woolcarder's son witnessing notarial papers, a young agent for Genoese merchant houses sailing to the island of Chios in the Aegean. What is certain is the education the Mediterranean gave for free. Coastal pilotage, the moods of weather, the habits of merchants, and 3 or 4 languages spoken badly, which is the sailor's portion everywhere. He read hungrily all his life, in the self-taught way. His surviving books are scribbled to the margins with thousands of notes. And men who knew him described the combination that would carry him so far and cost him so much. Vast confidence, vast persistence, and a touch of the prophet, all mounted on a genuinely first-rate seaman. The sea delivered him to his destiny by shipwreck. In 1476, sailing with a convoy off the coast of Portugal, his ship went down in a battle with pirates, and Columbus, wounded, swam for his life, clinging to a sweep of oar, and came ashore near Lagos, the very town, if you remember last week's story, where Gil Inez had sailed from, and where the sad meadow lay. Fate has a taste for geography. The half-drowned Genoese made his way to Lisbon, and Lisbon in the 1470s was simply the most exciting place in the world for a man of the sea. His younger brother Bartholomew was already there, working as a chart maker, and Christopher joined him at the trade. Think of what passed through a Lisbon chart shop in those years. The newest coastlines of Africa, fresh from the caravels, sailors' gossip from Madeira and the Azores, rumours of strange wood and carved flotsam washing up on the island's western shores after long west winds. Columbus sailed north, he tells us, as far as England and perhaps Iceland, south in Portuguese ships all the way to the new fortress of Elmina on the Gold Coast of Guinea. He married a Portuguese noblewoman, Felipa Perestrello, whose family held the captaincy of Porto Santo beside Madeira. And with her came her late father's papers and charts, and long quiet months on a small Atlantic island, where the great ocean fills every horizon and every thought. Somewhere in those years, the idea found him. Ideas like this one were in the air. Educated Europe had known since the Greeks that the earth was round. That is not the myth the schoolbooks made it. And a Florentine scholar named Toscanelli had already written to the Portuguese court, suggesting the Atlantic might be sailed westward to Asia. The question was never the shape of the world. The question was its size. And here Columbus performed one of history's most productive errors. Working through his authorities, Marco Polo's inflated Asia, Ptolemy's shrunken ocean, a misread Arab mile, he convinced himself the globe was far smaller than the geographers said, and Asia far wider, until the gap between Lisbon and Japan shrank in his figuring to some 2,500 miles of open water. A hard sail, but a possible one. The learned men who would later examine his plan did their sums honestly and got the true answer. 10,000 miles or more, an ocean no ship of the age could cross alive. The experts were right, Columbus was wrong, and between his error and their accuracy lay the small detail no one in Europe knew: 2 continents standing in the middle of the arithmetic. He took the plan first to the obvious customer, Portugal and King João II. The same hard, brilliant king whose captains were closing in on Africa's southern cape. João's experts heard the Genoese out, checked his numbers and turned him down flat. Their own numbers were better, and their own road to India, the real road around Africa, was nearly open. Why gamble ships on a dreamer's arithmetic? Columbus was in Lisbon, still the story goes, in the winter of 1488, when Bartolomeu Dias came home with the news of the Cape of Good Hope, was perhaps standing in the crowd as the report was made. Whatever hopes he still had of Portugal died that day. Portugal had its answer. So Columbus packed his charts and his growing collection of grievances and took the idea to the rising power next door, to Castile and Queen Isabella. What followed were 7 of the longest years a proud man ever waited out. Spain was busy, pouring everything into the final war against Granada, the last Muslim kingdom of the peninsula, and the Royal Commission appointed to study the proposal took 4 years to report, and then reported correctly that the ocean was too wide and the scheme unsound. Columbus trailed the itinerant court from siege to siege, living on hope and small retainers, wearing his threadbare dignity like a cloak. His wife had died. He left their young son Diego with friars at a monastery near Palos, and it was churchmen there, sympathetic to the strange, burning Genoese, who kept his cause quietly alive at court. He was on the point of taking the whole scheme to France when the war ended. In January 1492, Granada surrendered. Columbus was actually present to see the royal banners go up on the Alhambra's towers. With the war won, the calculus changed, and a royal treasurer named Luis de Santangel made the argument that finally landed. The cost of trying was trivial, a few ships, less than a week of war. The cost of letting France own the gamble, if it paid, was unbearable. A messenger overtook Columbus by the old story, a few miles down the road to France, and turned him around. Now it was Columbus's turn to drive a hard bargain, and he drove an astonishing one. By the agreement they signed at Santa Fe, this foreign commoner, if he succeeded, would become Admiral of the Ocean Sea, hereditary, Viceroy and Governor of whatever lands he found, and holder of 1/10 of all the wealth that ever flowed from them. The monarchs signed. Very likely their lawyers assumed the terms would never matter. Almost no one, after all, expected to see him again. The expedition, when it finally sailed, was a modest thing. 3 small ships and about 90 men, crewed largely out of the river town of Palos, and held together less by Columbus than by a local man the sailors actually trusted. Martin Alonso Pinzon, the town's leading sea captain, who took command of the Pinta and talked his neighbours aboard. The flagship Santa Maria was a tubby merchant carrack, slow and steady. The Pinta and the little Niña were caravels, daughters of Prince Henry's coast, quick and weatherly. On the 3rd of August, 1492, they dropped down the river from Palos on the ebb tide and put to sea. That the fleet existed at all owed as much to one local family as to the crown. The town of Palos owed the monarchs a fine, 2 caravels service for past smuggling, which is why the expedition was mounted there. But the sailors of Palos wanted no part of a Genoese dreamer's ocean, and recruitment was going nowhere until Martin Alonso Pinzon came home from a trading run. Pinzon was the port's leading captain, wealthy, respected, a man whose word moved crews. And when he declared for the venture, put his own money in, and took command of the Pinta with his brother Vicente on the Niña, the town's men followed him aboard within weeks. It is worth holding on to, for what came later, a fair share of the first crossing's courage was recruited on the credit of the Pinzon name, and Martin Alonso would go to his grave days after the triumphant return, believing a fair share of the glory should have followed it. The fleet nearly failed in its first week. 3 days out, the Pinta's rudder jumped its fittings twice, in what Columbus suspected was quiet sabotage by her owners, who had been pressed into the venture and wanted their ship back. The fleet limped into the Canaries and spent nearly a month there, refitting. The rudder repaired, and the little Niña, rigged Mediterranean fashion with triangular lateen sails, recut with square sails for the following winds ahead. It was an unglamorous, essential month. Voyages into the unknown, this series keeps finding, are won in the dockyard as often as at sea. Columbus's first decision was the quiet masterstroke of the whole enterprise. He did not strike west from Spain into the belt of contrary westerlies that had defeated every earlier probe of the Atlantic. He ran south first to the Canary Islands, and there, on the 6th of September, turned west with the northeast trade winds at his back. The same great wheel of wind the Portuguese had learned rounding Africa, now ridden out into the void. It was either luck or genius, and it hardly matters which. He had chosen the one latitude where the ocean itself would carry ships west, and though he could not know it, would carry them back further north. The road he picked in 1492 is the road sailing ships followed for 400 years. Life aboard, for those 5 weeks, ran on a rhythm as old as the trade. Watches of 4 hours, turned by the half-hour glass, which a ship's boy flipped and marked with a chanted verse, the nearest thing the ships had to a clock and to a choir. The men slept where they could, on deck or on the ballast, for cabins were for captains. They ate salt meat, hard biscuit, chickpeas and garlic cooked on a sandbox fire when the weather allowed, and drank wine that soured a little more each week. Mass verses were sung at dusk. It was crowded, wet, rank, and utterly ordinary. 90 men doing a familiar job, further from land than anyone had ever done it. Then came the days, day after day, of following seas and a fair blue wind. Beautiful weather, the crews agreed, and that was exactly what frightened them. How would they ever beat home against a wind that never stopped blowing west? They passed into the Sargasso Sea, where the ocean turns to meadow, mile upon mile of drifting golden weed, thick enough to whisper along the hull with bottomless blue water beneath. Their compasses began to stray from the North Star, a variation no one could explain, and the pilots muttered. Columbus kept 2 reckonings of the distance run, a private one and a smaller one for the crew, to soften the growing numbers, though some scholars note with a smile that his false count may have been the more accurate of the 2. He was also, mile by mile, proving himself the finest dead reckoning navigator of his age, a judgment his rivals conceded through gritted teeth, with no instruments worth the name. His attempts at celestial fixes on this voyage went comically wrong. Columbus steered by compass, sandglass, and an uncanny feel for speed and leeway. And his landfalls across 4 voyages kept vindicating him. Years later, on a different crossing, he would famously ride out a hurricane he had predicted, while the fleet that ignored him drowned. Whatever else history must weigh about the man, and it must, the seamanship was real, and it was extraordinary. Somewhere in that second week, the compass itself seemed to turn unreliable, the needle drifting away from the North Star as they sailed west, a thing the pilots had never seen in home waters. Columbus had, in fact, stumbled onto magnetic variation on an oceanic scale, and his response was pure Columbus. Privately, a careful log entry. Publicly, a soothing explanation. It was the star that moved, he told the pilots, not their needle. Delivered with total confidence and just enough truth in it to hold. He kept 2 reckonings of distance as well, one for himself and a shorter one for the crew. The old story says the public count was a comforting lie, though by a fine irony, his false figures, we now know, were often the more accurate ones. Command at sea in 1492 was 1 part navigation and 2 parts management of other men's fear. He logged it all with a lover's eye, the tuna and the flying fish, the little land birds that came aboard, rigging weary, the night the sea, in his words, ran like the river at Seville, and the air was sweet as April in Andalusia, and only the nightingale was missing. But by early October, 30 days out, sweetness was beside the point. The men had sailed further from land than any crew in the memory of their world. False landfalls had raised and broken their hearts. Clouds on the horizon at dusk, sworn to be islands, gone by morning. There was hard talk below decks about the sea having no end and a madman at the helm. Some muttered, the chronicles say, about easing the Genoese over the side some quiet night and telling Spain he fell. Even the Pinzon's patience was gone. Around the 10th of October, it came to open confrontation, and to the bargain we began with 3 days more. Then the birds thickened and a green branch floated past with a small flower still on it, and a carved stick that had known a human hand. On the last night, the whole fleet could smell the land before anyone saw it. that warm green smell of leaves and earth that comes off islands at night, unmistakable to sailors a month at sea. And at 2 a.m, Rodrigo de Triana saw the white line of the beach. At dawn they went ashore. The admiral in his scarlet, the royal banners of Castile snapping, the notary with his inkhorn to witness the words of possession. And the world's two halves stood looking at each other across a strip of coral sand. A word for Rodrigo before the story sweeps past him. The Crown had promised a lifetime pension of 10,000 maravedis to the first man to sight land, and Rodrigo de Triana's cry from the Pinta's forecastle was heard by a whole watch. But the admiral declared, on reaching Spain, that he himself had seen a glimmering light some hours earlier, a moving flame like a little candle rising and falling, too far off by every modern reckoning for any fire on that shore. And the pension went to Columbus, paid, in the crueler versions of the tale, out of the meat tax of Seville's butchers for the rest of his life. Whatever the light was, the ledger entry tells his own story about the man. He could share an ocean with 90 sailors, but not a beach. The island was one of the Bahamas. Its people, the Lucayan Taíno, called it Guanahani. Columbus named it San Salvador and wrote down that first evening what he saw. Handsome, well-made people, open-faced and unafraid, wearing little but ornaments, some of them small pieces of gold at the nose. They swam and paddled out to the ships, bringing parrots, balls of cotton thread, spears of cane. They traded eagerly and cheated no one. They handled the strangers' swords by the blade, not knowing edges. Whatever they made of the visitors, men from the sky, was the guess Columbus recorded. They offered, in his own repeated words, everything they had, with a generosity that astonished him. And here the story asks us to hold 2 sentences of his journal side by side, because both are real and both mattered. In one, he marvels at their gentleness and open hands. In another, written within days, he observes that they know nothing of weapons, and that with 50 men, all of them could be subjugated and made to do whatever one wished. The whole tragedy of the next century is folded quietly into that second sentence, like a blade in a letter. He also, before the first week was out, took captives, guides he called them, because the expedition's questions needed answering, and no one thought to ask the guides. The fleet's unity, though, was fraying on its own success. In late November, off Cuba, Martin Alonso Pinzon, the Pinta's captain, the fleet's co-maker, hearing island talk of gold, simply sailed off on his own to find it without leave and stayed gone 6 weeks. Columbus, seething in his journal, could do nothing. The Pinta was the fastest ship he had. The two would reunite by chance in January, patch a diplomatic peace, and then, on the voyage home, race each other across the winter Atlantic for the honour of first word. Storms decided it. Pinzon made a northern Spanish port, only to learn the Crown would hear the news from the Admiral himself, and ill, exhausted, and by tradition heartbroken, died within days of landing. He was the expedition's ablest seaman and its first casualty of glory. The questions, of course, were about gold and about Japan. For 3 months, the little fleet threaded the islands chasing both, through the Bahamas, along the vast green coast of Cuba, which Columbus decided must be a province of the Great Khan's China, sending inland envoys with Latin passports and Arabic interpreters, who found, instead of Cathay, villages of the Taíno, and men and women rolling dried leaves into tubes, setting them alight and drinking the smoke. They called the things tobaccos. The old world had just met tobacco, and hammocks too. The swinging woven beds the sailors adopted on sight and never gave up. Those island weeks fill some of the tenderest pages in the journal. Cuba's coast struck him nearly speechless. The loveliest land, he keeps writing, that eyes have ever seen. Harbours he wanted to describe and gave up on. Mountains blue with distance. The nights loud with birdsong and crickets. He wrote of villages where the fleet was fed and feasted, of the dignity of chiefs who dined with him aboard, of children carried down to see the ships. Whatever came after, and we will not look away from what came after, it is worth keeping this too. For a few weeks at the end of 1492, the meeting of the worlds was here and there, a series of dinners between curious neighbours. Then, in the small hours of Christmas morning, 1492, off the coast of the great island Columbus had named Hispaniola, the flagship found the other kind of history. The night was flat calm. The admiral, for once, was asleep. The helmsman, against standing orders, had handed the tiller to a ship's boy. The Santa Maria slid onto a coral bank so gently that no one woke, and then would not come off, and broke her back by inches as the swell worked her. The local Taíno ruler, a chief named Guanahani, sent his whole town out in canoes, and by Columbus's own account wept at the Spaniards' loss and salvaged every plank and nail for them, guarding it all so honestly that not a lace point went missing. Out of the wreck's timbers on that chief's land, the Spaniards built a small fort. They called it La Navidad, Christmas. And because the Niña could not carry everyone home, 39 men volunteered to stay and wait for the return. The first European settlement in the Americas, built of shipwreck and staffed by men no one had chosen for their patience. The voyage home nearly ended everything. In February, in the latitudes of the Azores, the Niña ran into winter storms so violent that the admiral, expecting to drown, wrote an account of his discoveries, sealed it in a barrel, and threw it into the sea for fate to deliver. Then vowed pilgrimages with his crew, drawing lots for who would carry each vow, and drawing himself more than his share. The little caravel survived, Prince Henry shipwrights had built well, and made port, of all places, in Lisbon, where King Joan II received the man his experts had rejected, heard him out, and by the account of those present, was gracious in public and shaken in private. Even landfall in the old world kept its drama. The storm first drove the Niña into the Portuguese Azores, where the local commander, taking the battered strangers for interlopers poaching Portugal's African preserve, arrested half the crew as they prayed, barefoot in their storm vows, at a shrine above the beach. It took days of threats and diplomacy to pry them loose. The age's rivalries, it turned out, had gotten home before he did. Spain gave him the springtime of his life. He crossed the peninsula in a slow triumph to the court at Barcelona. The crowds pressing to see the parrots, the green stone masks, the gold ornaments, and the 6 Taíno captives walking in that procession, whose own eyes and thoughts on Barcelona no chronicler troubled to record. The monarchs rose when he entered, seated him beside them, confirmed every extravagant title. For one season, the weaver's son from Genoa was the most celebrated man in Europe. The world's paperwork moved just as fast. Spain and Portugal, both hungry and both armed with papal blessings, sat down within the year and did an extraordinary thing. At Tordesillas in 1494, they drew a line down the map of the Atlantic from pole to pole, 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, and divided everything beyond it between them. West of the line, Spain. East of it, Portugal. A stroke of ink that would one day make Brazil speak Portuguese, and that calmly gave away continents no European had seen, inhabited by millions who were consulted. Of course, not at all. From that highest point, the story goes down. And honesty requires us to go down with it. The Armada's arrival set the pattern of everything after. 17 ships put 1,500 colonists, gentlemen, priests, labourers, not a farmer among too many of them, onto a coast with no gold mines in sight, and the new town of La Isabela, laid out with a church and a governor's stone house, began dying almost at once. Fevers, hunger, hurricanes, mutinous hidalgos who had come for treasure and were set to digging irrigation. Within a few years, it was abandoned to the geckos, the first European town in the Americas, and the first European ghost town in the same decade. Colonization, the sea was teaching, was not an event, but a grind. And the Admiral of the Ocean Sea, magnificent at sea, had no gift for the grind. The second voyage was an armada, 17 ships, more than 1,000 men, seeds and horses and cattle, colonization, not discovery. What it found at La Navidad was a burned stockade and 39 graves. The men left behind had turned to seizing gold, and women from the people around them, until a harder chief than Guanahani had wiped them out. The first lesson, unlearned of many. The colony Columbus, then planted on Hispaniola, turned quickly grim. He was a magnificent navigator and a poor governor, and the settlement's hunger for gold became a system. Tribute quotas of gold dust laid on every Taíno adult, brutally enforced, resistance answered with war dogs and massacre, and shiploads of enslaved islanders sent back to Spain, a traffic that troubled even Queen Isabella, who asked by what right her new subjects were being sold. Between the violence, the forced labour, and above all, the invisible armies of old world disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, against which the peoples of the Americas had no inherited defences at all. The Taíno of Hispaniola, perhaps hundreds of thousands of souls when the ships first came, all but vanished within 2 generations. It is one of the great catastrophes in the human story. They met the visitors with open hands. Let that at least be remembered of them, and their names spoken gently, the Taíno. It should be said plainly that some of the worst of Hispaniola was done under Columbus's authority, and some by the colonists against it. He hanged Spaniards as well, for rebellion and cruelty, and the settlers' bitterest complaint to the crown was less his conscience than his rule, a foreign upstart, high-handed with hidalgos. The crown's verdict, in any case, was practical. The admiral could discover, he could not govern, and Spain, having seen what lay across the ocean, no longer needed the one man who had insisted it was there. Columbus himself sailed twice more, and the ocean kept giving him wonders while the land took everything else away. On the third voyage, he touched South America at the Orinoco's mouth, and understood in a stunned journal entry that so vast a river of fresh water must drain not an island but a continent. Another world, he wrote, unknown until now. On land, though, his colony was in revolt, and a royal commissioner sent to investigate solved the problem simply. he arrested the Admiral of the Ocean Sea and shipped him back to Spain in chains. The sailors offered to strike the irons off. Columbus refused and wore them into port, and kept them, the story goes, hanging in his room for the rest of his life, to feed the grievance that had become his closest companion. There was a fourth voyage, in some ways his finest seamanship and his worst luck. Forbidden to land at the colony he had founded, he warned its officials of a coming hurricane by the signs he had learned to read. They laughed, sailed their treasure fleet into it, and drowned by the hundred, while his own battered ships rode it out. He groped down the coast of Central America, looking for a strait to the Indian Ocean that does not exist, lost his ships to storms and shipworm, and ended marooned for a full year on the beach at Jamaica, where, with his men starving because relations with the local Taíno had soured, he consulted his almanac, gathered the chiefs on the night of the 29th of February 1504, and told them his god would darken the moon in anger. And the eclipse came, blood red and terrifying, on schedule. It is the oldest trick in the adventure books, and it is apparently true. He died at Valladolid in 1506, 54 years old, moderately wealthy, bitterly litigious, and still insisting, against the growing knowledge of every pilot in Spain, that the lands he had found were the outskirts of Asia. He never knew what he had actually done. Perhaps no one who does something that large ever quite can. Even his bones kept sailing. Buried at Valladolid, moved to Seville, carried across the ocean in the 1540s to the Cathedral of Santo Domingo on his own Hispaniola, then evacuated to Havana when Spain ceded the island, then home again to Seville after 1898, where a grand tomb borne by 4 crown pallbearers holds him today. Except that in 1877, workmen in Santo Domingo turned up a lead casket inscribed with his name and titles, and that cathedral too maintains to this day that it holds the Admiral. DNA testing in Seville says its fragments are his. The Dominican casket has never been opened to science, so the man who crossed the ocean 4 times may, in death, have managed to remain on both sides of it at once. A final navigational feat, and somehow the right one. The Admiral's grievances, at least, proved heritable. He died clutching his book of privileges, the notarized collection of every promise the Crown had signed at Santa Fe. And his heirs spent the next half-century suing the Spanish monarchy over it. In a marathon of litigation, the archives call the Colombian lawsuits. Viceroyalties claimed, percentages haggled, titles clipped and regranted. 3 generations of lawyers dining out on 1 week's negotiation in a military camp in 1492. The family kept a dukedom out of it in the end. Somewhere in that mountain of parchment lies the age's driest lesson. Discovery is an event, but a contract is forever. The final ironies were distributed with the ocean's usual indifference. The continents took their name not from Columbus, but from a Florentine passenger and self-promoter, Amerigo Vespucci, whose vivid letters convinced a German mapmaker in 1507 to letter a name across the new southern landmass, America. By the time anyone thought to object, the name had sailed. And the reward for first sight in land, the royal pension promised to whichever lookout saw it first, was claimed by the Admiral himself. On the strength of a glow he said he had seen from the deck 4 hours before Rodrigo de Triana's cry. He drew that pension every year for the rest of his life. Of Rodrigo, the stories say only that he went to sea again, unpaid and unforgotten by history's small print. Two worlds joined in a night watch. And after tonight, nothing on either shore, plant or animal, sickness or supper, empire or idea, would ever stay on its own side again. Historians call it the Columbian Exchange, and it is simply the modern world beginning. But while Spain stumbled, gloriously and terribly, into continents it had not been looking for, Portugal, next door, had never taken its eye off the true prize. The road around Africa lay surveyed and waiting. And in the summer of 1497, 4 ships dropped down the Tagus from Lisbon under a captain with cold eyes and colder patience, bound at last for the real Indies. His name was Vasco da Gama, and he is where we go when next we meet. That is where we will leave it tonight. Sleep well wherever you are, and when you're ready, we'll go wandering again.